We will discuss Malevich's Black Square, perhaps the most talked about and misunderstood work of art. Art historians and viewers have debated for over a century without reaching an understanding. What makes the Black Square so remarkable? And today we will clarify everything for you. The Black Square has been interpreted in so many different ways. It's been called the first pixel, a portrait without a person, a night abyss, and even a turned-off television. But that, of course, is utter nonsense. There are dozens of legends and myths surrounding the square, some of which were created by art historians and, as we'll see later, by Malevich himself. Here are the most interesting ones. First, why aren't the sides of the square parallel, and why is the square not really a square? Second, why did Malevich use not just black pigment, but a mixture of paints? Third, what does the mysterious image and inscription recently discovered under the square mean? Fourth, why did Malevich paint 3 more squares? Black, red and white. Fifth, and most interesting, why did Malevich date his square 2 years earlier than its actual creation? By the end of this video, I'm sure you'll be able to answer all these questions yourself. So, Malevich created his square in 1915. It was a very interesting, truly iconic time in the history of art, when artists were constantly experimenting, searching for something of their own, something unique, competing with each other, and trying to find something new. What do you think drives any artist? Love for art? An irresistible urge to draw? For some artists, that's true. But let's remember that artists are people just like you and me. And the most important thing for them is fame and recognition. Artists are extremely vain and very jealous of the success of their peers. It's good to be known as a talented artist, but it's even better to be considered a genius. But the most prestigious and the peak of any artist's career is to become the founder of their own style of painting. And now, a couple of minutes of very important background so that you understand what was happening in the art world when Malevich created his Black Square. And for that, let's go back 50 years. It all started with Manet. In 1872, Manet presented the world's first Impressionist painting, Impression. It was after this painting that the famous art movement, Impressionism, was named, which turned the art world upside down. So what did Manet come up with? Watch. Up until that moment, the main and almost only measure of an artist's skill was their ability to depict objects in a painting as realistically as possible. The transparency of water, the folds of fabric, the softness of skin, the gleam on a jug, the emotions on a face. Everything was very simple and clear. If you draw realistically, it means you're a master. And then Manet declares that you can paint pictures in a completely different way. You can make just a couple of brushstrokes, and any viewer will recognize what's depicted. Moreover, they'll feel the mood of the painting. Of course, the critics ridiculed Manet, but the idea is so good that it captures the minds of artists, and they start experimenting. And over the next 20 years, Impressionism becomes the brightest and most fashionable movement in painting, and Manet becomes a master in his own lifetime. This had never happened before. Artists usually died in poverty and obscurity. And an incredible competition among artists begins, who will come up with the most original style of depicting objects. Who will be the next Manet? And in the following years, dozens of styles and movements appear. If Impressionism depicts objects with broad brushstrokes, then Pointillism breaks them down into dots. Fauvism makes objects flat and bright, and Primitivism simplifies what is depicted to almost childlike drawings. And in the course of these experiments, art moves further and further away from the tradition of depicting objects as they are in real life. Artists, on the contrary, begin to compete in how unrecognizable they can make objects look. And finally, in the 1910s, a few years before the square, Cubism appears, the invention of Picasso. Cubism proclaims the next bold step. It challenges the very object itself. Look, this is important. The violin in the image appears to be broken into pieces, but is still recognizable. Picasso really did just that. He cut the violin and hung its pieces on strings, then drew it. Cubism doesn't just depict objects in a stylistically original way. It minimizes the features of the object, leaving just enough for us to still recognize it. And that's a breakthrough. Picasso becomes world famous. Admirers and fans come to see him in Paris. And of course, every artist in the world dreams of becoming the next Manet or Picasso. And for that, you need to come up with your own movement in painting, your own ism. What else can you do if even the subject itself has already been dissected? There's only one small but very bold step left to get rid of the subject itself in the painting. However, no artist worldwide has ventured to do that yet. The artists of that golden era had no idea that art could be meaningless or unattractive. But this won't last long. And what about Malevich? Until 1910, Malevich was little known, so there is hardly any reliable information about him. He appeared in the public space only 7 years before the square, and his development as an artist would have remained a blank spot. But Malevich himself filled this gap at the end of his life by writing an autobiography, which most art historians rely on. It is from this source that they draw information and seriously tell us about black lightning bolts that supposedly ran across the canvas while the black square was being painted. In it, Malevich also claims that he began participating in exhibitions as early as 1898, 17 years before the black square. No documentary evidence of this has been found. However, it was only recently definitively established that a number of Impressionist works dated by Malevich to 1903, 1905, and of course mentioned in his autobiography, were actually painted by him at the end of his life. That is, we see that Malevich really wanted to present things as if he had arrived in Moscow, already a mature artist. He wanted to hide the lack of a significant creative path. Therefore, perhaps we shouldn't trust what Malevich wrote about himself. Because in reality, Malevich only begins to make serious attempts to become an artist only in 1905, 10 years before creating the square, after moving to Moscow and already being 27 years old. By the standards of that time, he was almost an old man. For 4 years in a row, Malevich tries to enter the Moscow School of Painting, and all 4 times he fails the exam. In his autobiography, Malevich wrote he didn't qualify due to his age, raising the logical question, why? Did he make 3 more attempts after his first failure? After all, he wasn't getting any younger each year. It's more logical to assume Malevich was simply not considered talented enough. Back then, things were strict with the black square. It would have been hard to convince anyone at an exam. Despairing of getting an art education, he starts taking private lessons from Rerberg. And already in his studio, in 1907, he meets Larionov, a star of the Russian avant-garde. This acquaintance becomes his ticket into the art crowd. And in 1910, he finally takes part in his first notable exhibition, the Jack of Diamonds, with 3 imitative paintings in the style of Matisse. Masters like Kandinsky, Fogg, Couperin and Larionov participate in this exhibition. Their fame also shines on Malevich, who was still little known at that time. By then, Malevich was already 32 years old. It must be said that all contemporaries who knew Malevich agree on 2 things about him. First, he was monstrously illiterate. He admitted this himself, calling himself a man without books. And second, he was extremely vain and simply overflowed with ideas, trying to find his place in painting. Larionov writes patronizingly about Malevich during that period, according to his own account. His general culture left much to be desired, and it can be said that his theoretical explorations were pure instinctive inspiration. Passionate in his work, he worked tirelessly. And we will soon see that it is precisely Malevich's enterprise and tirelessness that will help him achieve what he desires. Over the next 3 years, Malevich tries to catch up with the times and jumps from one movement to another. He tries everything: Cubism, Primitivism, Fauvism, and even achieves some recognition. He consistently remains in secondary or tertiary roles, overshadowed by the true stars. Of course, this doesn't suit the ambitious Malevich at all. And then, quite fortunately, Futurism comes to Russia, from France, the center of the art world at that time. This movement united artists, poets, writers, and musicians who intended to overthrow all classical canons of creativity and proclaim a new era in the world of art. These ideas are perfect for Malevich, who had not managed to achieve significant success in academic painting. And in 1913, 2 years before the Black Square, Malevich becomes one of the organizers of the Congress of Futurists of Russia, which is attended by as many as 3 people: the writer Krukchanik, the composer Matyushin, and the artist Malevich himself. Basically, three comrades of the new movement gathered at Matyushin's dacha, had some drinks, and declared it a Congress of the New Era. At that time, hardly anyone in Russia took futurists seriously, but Malevich wasn't bothered by that, because now he could call himself the main futurist artist of Russia, even if he was the only one for now. And then, a very important moment, our futurists decided to make themselves known as loudly as possible. And in that same year, 1913, they began working on an opera. It was called Victory Over the Sun. Victory Over the Sun. It was conceived as a manifesto of new art, as a challenge to the entire old world, and at the same time as a victory of man over everything natural and familiar. And now pay attention, this is the most important thing. What is the symbol of all living things on the planet in the sun? What can be opposed to the yellow circle of the sun? That's absolutely right. The black square, a combination of color and shape that never occurs in nature. Matyushin and Krukenik are writing the opera, and the title and contrast idea belong to them. Malevich reproduces their idea in the decorations, albeit timidly and unformed. That's what it looked like. It was at that time that the idea of the black square first appeared. The opera itself was monstrous. On stage, under grating music, meaningless poems were read out pompously. I'll give you an example and try to reproduce the tone in which all this was read so you can understand it more accurately. I eat dog and white-legged ones, a fried cutlet and rotten potatoes. Space is limited, the press must remain silent, Sheshacha. If you're trying to find even a drop of meaning in this, it's completely pointless. The futurists' goal differed entirely. They aimed to garner attention as loudly and originally as possible, creating hype in modern terms. That's why the music wasn't really music, and the poems essentially weren't really poems. The set design for this opera was done by Malevich. However, the noise was a success. The opera, of course, does not become a theatrical event, but it attracts enough attention to the futurists. People start discussing them and inviting them to art gatherings. Finally, Malevich begins to be recognized, but still only as part of a small and rather marginal movement. People treat him more with curiosity. Of course, that's not enough for Malevich. He doesn't want to be just a part, he wants to be the main one. He desperately wants to invent his own ism. In 1914, Malevich attempts to create a new painting movement called Februarism, declaring himself a Februarist. This movement won't last long, but for us it's still a very important moment. Look, Malevich refers to the cow and violin as his February works, with the violin choice being an attempt to compete with Picasso. But not having as powerful an idea as Cubism, Malevich simply takes the image to the point of absurdity by adding a cow to it. At the futurist exhibition Tramway B in March 1915, 3 months before the appearance of the Black Square, he displays a work called Composition with Mona Lisa. The choice of Mona Lisa is intentional and noteworthy. This work is legendary, embodying all classical art. In 1910, the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre, causing widespread public discussion. If you don't know this amazing story yet, be sure to watch my video about the theft of the Mona Lisa from the Louvre. And all these almost hysterical searches and struggles, step by step, bring Malevich closer to his main and only discovery in life. And in the summer of 1915, he finally has a breakthrough. Malevich himself is stunned by the boldness and conciseness of his discovery. After all, what could be more revolutionary and new than pure form, absolute non-objectivity? This is an unprecedented achievement, unmatched by any prior efforts. Abstractionists of that era came closest to portraying no real-world objects on the canvas. Wassily Kandinsky, our fellow countryman, and the Dutchman Piet Mondrian, who took the first steps toward his famous style, which even inspired Saint Laurent to release a clothing collection in the 60s. But both of them are still trying to depict something aesthetically pleasing, with recognizable proportions and a balanced composition. Their paintings still contain a recognizable object, albeit barely. No one before Malevich dared to take the final step and abandon the recognizable object in the painting. Malevich is the first to take this step with his black square. Do you understand? It was Malevich who, for the first time, took that desperate and almost insane step for those times and rejected any objectivity in the painting. It was at this significant moment that modern art of pure form began. And at the same time, it was the artist's rejection of our approval as viewers. And so it is not the most talented artist who comes up with a brilliant idea. Now he must not miss his chance, not let the golden fish slip away, and do everything right. And as we know, Malevich is not lacking in vanity or energy. And watch how he will fight for his idea. Malevich starts coming up with names for his style. It has to be something provocative, loud, absolute, destroying everything that came before. And he comes up with the name Suprematism. If you translate it into Russian, it would be something like the bestism or superism, if you like. Something supreme, the best, the coolest. Look at all the names of the movement. In painting, style names describe the technique and idea. Impressionism, broad brushstrokes. Cubism, rectangular forms. Pointillism, dots. Fauvism, wild colors. Abstractionism, abstraction. Only Suprematism doesn't describe the painting itself. It simply boastfully proclaims, "I'm better than everyone else." But from a marketing point of view, it's a great idea. So Malevich now has the full set. There's a painting, an idea, and the name of his own ism. And he starts preparing for the premiere of his discovery. At the end of 1915, in 6 months, there's a planned exhibition of Futurists, a group he still publicly associates with. By then, the movement had thrived and attracted many Russian avant-garde artists, all seeking self-discovery and fresh concepts. Each of them is preparing something unique for the exhibition and hopes that he will be the star of the show. And, as is usual in the jealous environment of artists, an unspoken competition begins among them. Who will come up with something special, something unique that will outshine everyone else? And Malevich passionately joins this competition, which the other artists do not suspect yet. You're going to laugh now, but suddenly Malevich realizes that he has a problem. The simplicity and conciseness of his idea have a downside. The black square is easy to copy, yes, anyone can draw a black square. And the very thought that so often comes to us when we look at modern art also occurred to Malevich himself, the first among artists. Even a child could draw this, and this thought frightens him terribly. Malevich is very worried. Back then, there was no internet, so information spread slowly. Therefore, Malevich doesn't know what's happening in Russia, let alone in the world. What if someone has already come up with the black square? What if someone has already taken away his laurels as a pioneer? Such a situation would be terrible for any ambitious person, and for Malevich it becomes almost an obsession. That's why Malevich does all his subsequent work literally behind closed curtains, not letting anyone into his studio. He prepares another 38 suprematist works, trying to stake out all possible forms. That's how the black circle, the black cross, and the other suprematist compositions appear. For the exhibition, a list of painting titles is required, but Malevich is afraid to even do that. So he gets clever and submits a list with very vague descriptions of the paintings, which don't mention suprematism or even hint at what's depicted in the artwork. As one of his associates, Varvara Stepanova, a theater artist and the wife of Alexander Rodchenko, would later say, Malevich discovers suprematism but keeps silent about it until the exhibition, wants to disrupt the exhibition and manages to have it called the last Futurist exhibition. He is helped by Puni and Punka. The atmosphere around Malevich grows tense. It's clear he has discovered something, but remains silent. Everyone tries their best to uncover what he will name his works. And here is another episode which Jacobson mentions. I went to see Malevich, we had lunch, and then something happened that surprised me. Malevich was terribly afraid that people would find out what new things he was working on. He told me a lot, but he didn't dare show his new works. Kruchenik then made a joke that Malevich and Morganov were so afraid of publicity, so afraid that their inventive secrets would be discovered and stolen, that they painted in complete darkness. And then a terrible incident happened. In September 1915, 3 months before the exhibition, Ivan Puni, Malevich's friend and associate, unexpectedly burst into Malevich's studio and saw Malevich's paintings. Malevich did not anticipate this. And now Malevich has a completely opposite task. Once the painting has been seen, once the idea has left the studio, it's necessary to claim authorship as quickly as possible, so that no one has time to copy such an easily copied work and present the idea as their own. He frantically writes to Matyushin, the author of those very poems for the opera Victory Over the Sun, "Dear Mikhail Vasilievich, I've been caught like a chicken in the soup. I'm sitting here working with my art hung up. Suddenly Puni walks in, indicating my works have been seen. Now, no matter what, I need to release a brochure about my work and give it a name and thus secure my copyright. I await your advice. The exhibition opens December 1st. Help me. I'm going to war soon. This is my final appearance. Yours, Kazimir." And there's a note on the side, "Tear up this letter." Thus, a brochure appeared. From Cubism to Suprematism, the new pictorial realism, which all art historians call the manifesto of modern art. But we see that this manifesto wouldn't have even seen the light of day if it weren't for Malevich's paranoia. Matyushin urgently publishes the brochure. By the way, Matyushin didn't like Suprematism. In his letters, he criticized Malevich, but Malevich didn't even reply to the letter from his comrade and friend. Besides the brochure, Malevich comes up with a small act of sabotage at the exhibition. He enlists the support of several comrades and tries to convince other futurists to rename the exhibition as The Last Futurist, cleverly intending to establish Suprematism as the killer of Futurism. The other futurists don't understand this yet, but Malevich is very persistent and they agree. At the exhibition, Malevich faces a serious competitor in Tatlin. He is preparing his innovative three-dimensional abstract reliefs, counter-reliefs, as he himself calls them. And Malevich tries to introduce rules for the exhibition that would disqualify Tatlin. However, all of Tatlin's associates threaten to withdraw from the exhibition, and this time Malevich suffers defeat. As a result, in November 1915, just a month before the exhibition, at one of the artists' meetings, Malevich finally announces his discovery and explains it. The reaction of his associates is mixed. Everyone understands that the idea is good. They suddenly got a serious competitor at the exhibition, and he has every chance to steal the spotlight. And the quarrel begins. Malevich is forbidden to use the word Suprematism in the titles of his paintings, and his proposal to use it in the name of the exhibition is rejected. The most renowned participant, Exter, refuses to take part in the exhibition at all because her works are also almost non-objective. Some Cubists also threaten to withdraw from the exhibition but never follow through. Later, as a form of protest, they will hang a poster in their exhibition called The Room of Professional Painters, hinting that Malevich is an amateur. But if Malevich was an amateur at anything, it certainly wasn't in the art of public relations and entrepreneurship. The exhibition starts and he just bursts into activity. While the other artists are hanging their paintings in the halls in the usual way, Malevich does everything he can to get noticed. First of all, since he was forbidden to use Suprematism in the official promotional materials of the exhibition a couple of hours before it opened, Malevich hand-painted several large posters and hung them right in his hall. They said Suprematism of painting, not just Suprematism, but Suprematism of painting, meaning the pinnacle of painting. Secondly, Malevich hangs his square not on the wall, but in the red corner, the way only icons were hung, hinting at the divinity of his work. No one had ever done anything like this before, and for Russia at that time, which was very religious, it was almost a scandal. Thirdly, while other artists passively wait for critics and viewers, Malevich runs around the exhibition, handing out a brochure written by Matyushin, and practically drags people into his hall, taking them away from the competitors. At the exhibition entrance, Malevich's friend Puni stands, distributing brochures and guiding visitors directly to Malevich's hall, skipping other artists' works. Boldness is a second kind of happiness, but you have to admit, such enterprise and assertiveness are something to envy. As a result, Malevich succeeds in everything. Visitors, critics, and newspapers talk only about Malevich. The buzz itself is more important to him than the critics' opinions, despite their differing views. The key is to assert your authorship and amplify your voice to the fullest extent possible. "I'm not an imitator of nature, I'm a creator of something new," says Malevich. Not very modest, but we wouldn't expect anything else from him. "I am the apostle of new concepts in art and a surgeon of the mind, sitting on the throne of creative pride. And I declare the Academy a stable for Philistines." But how could it be otherwise, since the Academy never accepted Malevich? However, critics are lukewarm about his idea. A very famous critic, Alexandre Benoit, writes in the newspaper Rec in January 1916, "Without a number, but in the corner, high up under the very ceiling, in a sacred place, hangs a work by Mr. Malevich." This is one of the acts of self-assertion of that principle, which bears as its name the abomination of desolation, and which boasts that through pride, through arrogance, through trampling on everything loving and gentle, it will lead everyone to ruin. Benoit's words can be considered prophetic because it was the black square that became that Pandora's box, which opened the way for art that no longer had to be beautiful or even understandable to us, the simple, uninitiated viewer. Let me say a few more words about what happened after the exhibition. Despite the beauty of the idea and the hype created by Malevich, the professional community did not accept his ideas for a long time. They were just too radical. But 2 years later, in 1917, the revolution broke out, and Malevich was a perfect fit for its propaganda machine, a misunderstood genius of the new wave, fighting against the stagnation of the old world. Fortunately, Malevich's brother, Mstislav, was a big shot among the Bolsheviks, and Malevich, although not very sympathetic to the Bolsheviks, realized that he could take advantage of the situation. He gets a high position in the Ministry of Art and instantly becomes very influential. Malevich uses his influence to promote suprematism by creating a school, gathering students, publishing a newspaper, and gradually earning the respect of fellow artists. Only in 1929, 14 years after creating the Black Square, does Malevich gain international recognition. He holds an exhibition in Berlin, and the whole world learns about Malevich. In his later years, Malevich abandoned Suprematism and returned to Impressionism. It is at that time that he will paint several works, which he dates to 1903-1905, trying to create a more appealing picture of his own journey. Malevich died in 1935, and his followers arranged a lavish funeral for him in a coffin shaped like a suprematist cross. As you can see, even in his death, the artist put on a show. Suprematism dies with him and does not receive any significant continuation. But he accomplished his mission. He made his statement very clearly and distinctly, and forever changed the world of art. For better or worse, we will return to this question more than once. Well, now that you know the whole story, I'm sure it won't be too hard for you to find the answers to the mysteries we talked about at the beginning of this video yourself. But let's try. So why isn't the black square actually square, and why aren't its sides parallel? Let's try to look at the situation through Malevich's eyes. He invented the black square and was obsessed with the fear of copying. But how can you make a square unique? After all, aren't all squares by definition the same? The only way is to make it not a square. There are millions of possible rectangles. Only then a potential idea thief won't be able to say it's just a coincidence. So the fact that the black square isn't perfectly square is most likely an attempt to protect the copyright of his idea. This is also supported by the painting's original title, Black Suprematist Quadrilateral. That's exactly what Malevich called it at first, and he renamed it later when his authorship was undeniable. Let's move on. Why did Malevich use a mixture of paints in the painting instead of just black pigment? And again, if we go back to what Malevich feared and desired, the answer becomes obvious to us. Black pigment is the same on any painting. But Malevich needed to make a unique black square at any cost, so he added a second layer of protection against copying, a unique mixture of paints. Besides, it's also a very successful gesture. Malevich as if mixes all the paints of academic painting and turns them into a black square. The next mystery. It was recently discovered that under the black square there is another image and a curious inscription. And that's very interesting. This happens very often in painting, and art historians love to create an air of mystery about the artist's secret message. But in most cases, the explanation is very simple. Canvas costs money, and artists didn't throw away unsuccessful paintings. They would paint new ones right on top of the old ones. However, in our case, I think that Malevich did this intentionally. The first layer under the square is a colored abstraction, and knowing Malevich's obsession, we can assume that this is most likely yet another, a third level of protection. And again, a lofty message. It's as if he is destroying colored art by painting over it with his square. And what does the inscription say? It's very inappropriate these days, but for the sake of historical accuracy, I'll quote it unabridged. It reads, "Battle of black men in a dark cave." This may seem like nonsense, but it isn't. The thing is, Malevich's square was not the first or even the second square in the history of art, and Malevich certainly knew this. In 1607, 300 years before the square, the English thinker Robert Fludd depicted the emptiness of the world before its creation and called his painting The Great Darkness. In 1843, the Frenchman Bertal created the painting Under the Cover of Night, and in 1893, just 20 years before Malevich, the eccentric Frenchman Alphonse Allais created his black square. Guess what it was called? The Battle of Negroes in a Cave at Night. They all painted a black square, but they all tried to give it a name that relates to something in real life. None of them thought to simply call the black square a black square. And we can see yet another, a fourth level of protection. Thus, Malevich proclaimed the supremacy of the black square not only over all other art, but also over all other black squares created before him. By the way, when art historians discovered this inscription a few years ago, they realized that for 100 years the painting had been displayed upside down. So why did Malevich create several black squares? Art historians will tell you that he was trying to rethink himself, but what can you rethink in a black square? It's much more plausible that Malevich, having created nothing else of value, was simply trying to replicate his best work, attempting to leave as significant a mark on art as possible. This is very common among people of a single work. There are actors, singers and painters known for a single iconic work, like Munch and his painting The Scream. And I will definitely tell you a very interesting story about him in one of the next videos. But what about the last and most interesting, Canning? Why did Malevich date the black square 2 years earlier than he actually created it? I'm sure now you can easily answer this question yourself. Write your guesses in the comments and I'll definitely reply to you there and in the next video. Well, now I'm sure you'll be able to put any art expert in their place if they start telling you about the darkness of the cosmos emanating from the black square. Because, as we now understand, the black square is just a black square. A brilliant work that even a child could draw. Subscribe to my channel and leave your comments. And in the next video, I'll tell you about that very painting by Manet Impression, which sparked a revolution in the art world. That's also a very, very interesting story.